Thank you to our AV team for getting us all set up with this new format today. And thanks to all of your members for joining me live from my dining room today. I so wish I could be with all of you in person, but I'm happy you could join me virtually so I can share this story with you. So let me switch our slides here so you can look at some art instead of my face. All right. So today I'll be talking about a really unique initiative. In 1979, King County Arts Commission sponsored a new project, which they titled Earthworks, Land Reclamation as Sculpture. This initiative proposed earth art as a tool to rehabilitate technologically abused land. At the time, King County had over 100 publicly owned surplus gravel pits, surface mines, landfill sites, what one report described as scars that dot the landscape. And under this project, the county proposed bringing 8 internationally renowned land artists to King County to rehabilitate these sites through sculptural intervention. The project was conceived in 2 parts. The first was to realize the rehabilitation of Johnson Pit number 30, an abandoned 4-acre gravel pit in SeaTax in South King County. This earthwork was realized by Robert Morris and completed in 1979. You can see it here shortly after it was completed. And a much more recent photo by yours truly just last weekend. Part 2 of this project consisted of a design symposium where the county invited 6 other artists and assigned them specific sites and asked them to create earthwork proposals / reclamation plans for each of these sites. These 6 additional proposals were never realized, but the artists during their time in King County generated drawings and models that would travel in an exhibition for 2 years, starting at Seattle Art Museum, and in the 90s would be donated by the county to SAM and now live in SAM's permanent collection. The symposium also highlighted a parallel project that was undertaken at the same time by the city of Kent, who invited Bauhaus artist Herbert Bayer to make a proposal for a site that had serious erosion problems that could double as a park, a stormwater detention dam, and an earthwork at the same time. He participated in that symposium, and this project was realized in 1982. And here's another recent photo of today. I won't be going into great detail in this particular project because it was parallel but separate from that symposium, but I want to flag it to make sure you know that you can visit that site as well today in Kent. Overall, the symposium represented a really unprecedented collaboration between contemporary artists and a public government agency to creatively solve this problem of damaged landscapes. It received wide critical acclaim, though local reactions were mixed. We'll get into that a little later. But it also raised a lot of questions. First and foremost, does art have to perform a function to be considered useful, to be supported by the public in this way? And more broadly, what are the implications of using art to reform abused landscapes? Now, before we get into that, let's take a step back and talk about what on earth do we mean by earthworks? Earthworks, also known as land art, was part of a wider conceptual art movement of the 1960s and 70s, in which artists used the natural landscape itself to create sculptures, site-specific installations, or interventions. In these kinds of work, the earth itself is the medium, and the work of art and landscape are inextricably linked. Now, I'm showing you here on this slide probably the most famous work of land art by the pioneer, some would say founder of the movement, Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson. This work is located on the northeastern shore of the Great Salt Lake and is composed of 6,000 tons of black basalt rocks that form a 1,500-foot-long coil that extends into the lake. Obviously, scale is a crucial factor of works like this, but you'll see also that using that rock from that site to compose the work is of central concern to this movement. The Earthworks and land art movement is connected in many ways to the rising environmental movements of the 1960s and 70s, of course, as artists were concerned over what they saw as a disengagement of modern art from social issues. Artists at the time were also reacting against what they saw as an overly commodified and commercialized art market in the late 1960s. So this is work taken out of the gallery context. Obviously, something like this cannot be displayed indoors other than photographic evidence and documentation, and also cannot be sold. Now, as soon as I say that, I'm going to put an asterisk on it because, of course, some works were made for and brought into the gallery space, including Smithson's early non-sites, in which he brought Earth from a specific site into the gallery, creating a non-site that displaces the Earth while connecting it back to that external location. But that aside, the works that we most associate with land art and earthworks are those monumentally scaled works that exist in the landscape. For example, Nancy Holt's sun tunnels, these concrete cylinders located in the desert of Utah that are aligned with the sun on summer and winter solstices. Or Walter DiMaria's lightning field, this time in the desert of New Mexico, which is composed of 400 stainless steel poles installed in a grid. All of these works are intended to be experienced durationally, both in the way you move through them and in the way time changes your viewing experience of them, whether it's affected by the seasons, the time of year, the movement of the planets in the case of Nancy Holt, or the weather in the case of the lightning fields. Closer to home, a land art commission that is located right here in the city of Seattle is Michael Heiser's Adjacent Against a Pond. This work was commissioned by the city for the Myrtle Edwards Park, which is located just north of the Olympic Sculpture Park, in 1976. For this work, Heiser brought giant granite slabs down from the Cascade Mountains and positioned them in a kind of grammar of space adjacent against and upon these man-made concrete slabs. But he's also creating this sort of grammar relationship about you moving between these forms within this urban space. Now, I mentioned this project partly because it's something that you can go see right now in the city of Seattle, but also to show that the city had already ventured, kind of dipped its toe into public land art by the time the Earthworks Symposium was proposed. So the public and government agencies were already familiar with this kind of work when they proposed the 1979 Sculpture Symposium. They began by designating sites, starting with that Johnson Pit number 30. This was a gravel pit in SeaTac that was chosen as the pilot site, and it had been used by the county as a gravel pit for about 4 decades up until the 1940s. Since then, it had partly reforested itself, and you can see that here in that outline form. But it had also just become a dumping ground for abandoned cars and appliances and was really a priority to rehabilitate at that time. So the committee for the symposium started with this as the pilot site and selected Robert Morris for the commission. Now, Robert Morris is a name that might be familiar to you if you've spent some time in the modern contemporary galleries or if you've attended one of these lectures before, as I believe Katerina Manchanda gave a lecture entirely on this unassuming box by Morris in our collection called Box with the Sound of Its Own Making. Morris came out of the New York Minimalist School, and he was an artist who was really engaged in emphasizing process, as you can see in this humble little box. Looks very simple at first, but when you're in the space with it, you hear a recording embedded within the box of the artist making the work itself, placing the process of making on equal footing with the actual art object. Morris had, in fact, already realized an earthwork in Washington State at Western Washington University in Bellingham. You see an image of that here. This work is an underground fountain that creates clouds of misty steam based on environmental conditions. So again, something that embeds the process of it coming into form, but also something that you experience differently over time in different seasons and in different weather conditions. For the King County Earthworks project, he proposed something that looks kind of like this. And this is the model that he made for that 1979 symposium and exhibition. Johnson Pit consists of a series of descending concentric slopes and benches, cleared of trees and planted with grass, that the whole form in total descends into a kind of meditative bowl-like form. The terracing that he built into this references sites from antiquity to the present. Just a few that he mentioned include palaces, strip mines, mountainside agricultural cultivation, Persian gardens, ancient amphitheaters. You can see some of that in the forms there that he's creating, and you can see that in the terracing in this design that he's created. Now, I said it was cleared with trees and planted with grass. The exception to that, oh, I'm sorry, one more slide that shows you more clearly that kind of steep gradation of the terracing that he was creating. Now, the exception to the trees that he removed, you can see in this image of the work in progress that there were some tree stumps left on the site that had been there since it was a gravel pit. And he decided to leave some of those stumps, which he called a ghost forest. He retained these to reference the original destruction of the land, but also in a way references the original forested land that existed before, both before his intervention and before intervention was needed. Now, there are some similarities, of course, between this work and some of those large-scale earthworks that we looked at before. Scale is one of them. This is a large site. It uses the earth itself as a medium in building it. It's site-specific, by which I mean it was specifically designed for and built in a specific place. And it uses time as a dimension. You move through and around these spaces, but also time has affected the site. Again, here's the picture when it was first installed. Here's a picture of it now. You see how the terraces have changed a little bit, the grass has grown, and the environment around it has changed a great deal. So a lot of similarities between those earlier works by Smithson and Holt. But the public nature of this sculpture is really what makes it so different. Those earlier works that I showed you examples of, you really have to make a pilgrimage to the desert to see them. And public access is at the heart of this project. Smithson himself described it thusly: it would not be accurate to designate privately funded early works of Smithson or Heiser or Di Maria in remote parts of the desert as public art. The only public access to such works is photographic. Here again, public access is at the primary heart of this. And you can see even how the public has grown up around the sculpture and these condos that are that now exist all around it. This work also differs in that it moves away from pure formal or pure environmental considerations and is more a part of the time and place in which it exists. Again, Smithson talked about the contrast to those remote earthworks, saying that this work is more often informed by social, economic, political, and historical awarenesses. So here we have a work that is site-specific not just in terms of the natural landscape, but also the human landscape around it. Now, Smithson really advocated for an open interpretation of his work and an open interpretation of this site, although he acknowledged that came with some challenges. Quote, "that my art offers the freedom to experience and question is not an opportunity that its audience always welcomes." And indeed, while this work was widely acclaimed in art circles locally, nationally, and even internationally, it got some mixed reviews at home. I'm showing you just a couple what I thought were really funny examples from the King County Archives of the kind of public reactions that came up around this work. For some, there was a misconception about how this was paid for. For others, members of the public, they were unaware that this was even happening until the day it opened, and were unaware that it was an artwork. Indeed, if you visit it today, there's very little signage, just one stone plinth that designates it as an earthwork by Robert Morris. And also, outside of members of the public, you had King County Council members questioning its use, especially after the work suffered from erosion after heavy rains only 1 month after its completion. Don't worry, it was repaired beautifully by the county. So even though this work really succeeded as a public earthwork and as a reclamation tool of the site, still questions arose about defending its usefulness. We'll come back to that. Now, as construction of Johnson Pit was just beginning, part 2 of this project, you'll recall, the symposium that invited additional artists in, was launched with the artists and their proposals. All 6 artists were assigned technologically damaged sites and asked to address these issues of public access and use in different ways. I'm going to run fairly briefly through all 6 of these proposals so you can get a sense of the variety of what these artists were thinking about. Beginning with Ian Baxter, who was assigned a gravel pit in Snoqualmie. This was a really steep site with bad erosion problems, so he proposed another steeply graded amphitheater. The style might look sort of familiar with these terraces, but in Ian Baxter's proposal, those terraces were to be paved as asphalt jogging tracks with exercise stations along the whole route. Now down in the base there, and you see a kind of pull-out model of the same on the right, he built these infinity mounds, which provided fitness stations for visitors in wheelchairs around the whole circumference. So this was a site that he was really conceiving for a specific use, but still he was thinking of this as sculpture first and foremost. He emphasized that this was to be a great sculptural place, and was really concerned with the concept of bigness, with sculpture as a dimension, a physically large dimension in society and in social activities. Richard Fleischner was also assigned a gravel pit, this one 340 acres that consisted of 2 horizontal planes, one 300 feet higher than the other. So for this very challenging site, he made 2 proposals, one that involved cutting a 200-foot high office complex into the cliff face here with steep terracing descending from the building. And the other proposal suggested digging a 500 square foot sod pyramid into the earth where water would gather and by a series of underground pipes run to a reflecting pool down on the base of the terrace here, allowing this to function for drainage, but also to have a really meditative space. This site, I'll note, was the only one that was working with a private company, with the Lakeside Sand and Gravel Company, and they went through the process of an engineering facility review, but unfortunately this one, like all of these projects, was never realized. Lawrence Hansen, moving right along, yet another gravel pit, and in his case, he wanted to create a design that made only slight modifications to the existing site, but still was an obvious intervention in the larger environment. So you can see this still has kind of an echo of that original gravel pit, but here he wanted to carve an oval bowl out encircled by a walkway and fill that bowl with white stones that would reflect the natural light. Now, of course, we live in Seattle and we only get so much sunlight and it's sometimes nighttime. So he also wanted to insert lights under those stones that would come on at night to radiate the space. Like lightning field, this is something in which time would really become a factor in viewing, both the quality of weather and time of day, of course. Mary Miss was assigned a very difficult site, this narrow strip of land right next to SeaTac Airport that had been cleared of homes when the airport was built. So this site still had old foundations of houses, plants, roadways, and rather than clearing all of that out, Mary Miss proposed a project in which she built 16 structures that used those abandoned forms as their base. These structures could be passively or actively experienced by walking around or climbing on, moving through. And some offered views of the SeaTac runway that was right next door, while others offered a sense of seclusion from that very noisy site. Dennis Oppenheim, what was probably the most imaginative of all the 6 projects, which he titled Waiting Room for the Midnight Special, a Thought Collision Factory for Ghost Ships. What a wonderful title, I have to say. This was on a torn airstrip between the new Magnuson Park and a site that was supposed to be for future government facilities. And he proposed this fantastic dream environment for the facilitation of the movement of thoughts. In this circular space that you see here, what he conceived of as a waiting room, he built 4 gates that would allow for the movement respectively of energy, ideas, power and communication, and what he deemed ghost ships to move through. So here he's thinking of use less of physical movement and more the circulation of concepts. And last but certainly not least, we have Beverly Pepper, another name that might be familiar to you if you spend some time at the Olympic Sculpture Park, where we have 2 sculptures by Beverly Pepper installed. Beverly Pepper was assigned the Montlake landfill on the eastern end of UW's campus. That's now the Union Bay Natural Reserve, a really beautiful site. But at the time it was a landfill. And she proposed for this viewing structures for both the man-made and the natural environment. Connected by a walkway, she would position 2 structures, one a 20-foot high earth mound that could be climbed, of course, to get a better view, but also would be cut away, which you can see on the top left corner of this drawing that she created for the proposal, would be cut away and inserted with glass, so you could see the roots of plants, the gravel that built it up, but also decades of garbage deposits from the landfill. On the other side of that walkway, the other structure was a 100-foot circle of posts, which you would install as a monitoring station to measure future shifts in land levels. So here's a site and proposal that acknowledges what the site was, but also what it may become in the future and how this land has to continually be monitored. Now, obviously, these projects range widely in how they alter and rehabilitate their original sites, how they define usefulness, and how they define public access. Unfortunately, as I said, none were realized, but they all answer the question of how and even whether art has to function, with 6 very different answers. But we have one more question that I'd like to address that Robert Morris actually posed in his keynote speech for that 1979 symposium. And he says it best, so I'll play it here, hopefully, yes.
But a few things have not been discussed so far by anyone to my knowledge about art as land reclamation. The first seems rather bizarre to me, and that is that the selling point is, that the art was going to cost less than restoring the site to its, quote, natural condition. What are the implications of this kind of thinking? That art should be cheaper than nature? Or that site works can be supported and seen to be relevant by a community only if they fulfill a kind of sanitation service? The most significant implication of art as land reclamation is that art can and should be used to wipe away technological guilt. Do those sites scarred by mining or poisoned by chemicals now seem less like the entropic liabilities of ravenous and short-sighted industry and more like long-awaited aesthetic possibilities? Will it be a little easier in the future to rip up the landscape for one last shovelful of a non-renewable energy source if an artist can be found, cheap mind you, to transform the devastation into an inspiring and modern work of art, or anyway, into a fun place to be, well, at the very least, into a tidy, mugger-free park? It would seem then that artists participating in art as land reclamation will be forced to make moral as well as aesthetic choices. There may be more choices available than either a cooperative or critical stance for those who participate. But it would perhaps be a misguided assumption to suppose that artists hired to work in industrially blasted landscapes would necessarily and invariably choose to convert such sites into idyllic and reassuring places, thereby socially redeeming those who wasted the landscape in the first place. Thank you.
Talk about a mic drop at the end there. Moral as well as aesthetic choices. Here, Morris is posing not how land can be reclaimed and rehabilitated by sculpture, but whether it should. And again, the artists participating in the symposium answered this very difficult question in 6 very different ways. Mary Miss and Beverly Pepper, I'm reminding you of their proposals in the images here, revealed the previous destruction of their designated sites in their final designs. Mary Miss by building upon the foundations that were destroyed and in the case of Beverly Pepper, of laying bare that history of destruction and garbage deposits, not wiping away the past, but revealing it for future generations. On the other end of the spectrum, though, Richard Fleischner, Ian Baxter, and Robert Morris himself really disguised the original site into a more beautiful, meditative space in the final Earthworks sculpture. In many ways, the moral quandary that Morris proposes is an unanswerable question, or rather, not to be answered universally, but will be answered individually by each artist, as we see here. In my humble opinion, the environmental benefit far outweighs the downside. And as public art, we must speak of social benefit as well. We have an immense social benefit to having these accessible, free public artworks that are also these beautiful meditative spaces. Now, I've talked a lot about how these works are experienced over time, durationally, how time informs how we experience all of these artworks, and who could have predicted times like these? I am feeling especially grateful to have these earthworks realized, this Robert Morris and the Herbert Bayer, which we didn't get into, I'm afraid, but even to have the proposed earthworks dreamed up in times like this, when we can visit outdoor public sites to access art during these days of social distancing. That is what I have prepared for you today. It is too brief to get into such a meaty topic, but with that, I would love to take some of your questions.
Okay, Carrie. So can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. We're going to start with, there were a couple of questions that came about related to Gasworks. What do you think of Gasworks Park in this context?
Ooh, interesting question. I'm not too schooled in the history of Gasworks Park. It certainly is more than a park, and it certainly reveals that industrial history. So, I mean, Seattle is familiar in this kind of language. We're familiar with not erasing our history, not erasing the environmental damages and implications thereof. And we're familiar in trying to move forward with those kinds of sites and questions. Gasworks, I think, is a great example of that, of public space that is beautiful and public and accessible and enjoyed by all, while also being a very stark reminder of what was there before. I mean, I didn't get into it in this talk, but the Olympic Sculpture Park is another site, not an artwork itself, of course, so a little different from what we're talking about here, but another site that reclaimed damaged landscape. That site was a brownfield before it was converted into this beautiful park today.
So along those lines, what do you think about the Olympic Sculpture Park, and would it be considered an earthwork?
No, I would not consider the Olympic Sculpture Park an earthwork. With earthworks, we're really talking specifically about sculpture that uses earth as medium. So in the case of Robert Smithson, and I bring him up as an example because I showed two works by him. One is, in the site and in the landscape, and is a space that you can be in. But that smaller sculpture that is in the gallery space is also an earthwork. It's referring to physical earth, physical landscape, physical nature by using physical earth, landscape, and nature. So the sculpture park, while a beautiful site that was also a land reclamation project, and that host sculpture is not in itself a sculpture. It's a fine distinction, but an important one.
Great. A couple people are interested to know about where they could find earthworks. Are there any in the Pacific Northwest?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. These are in King County. You can visit them today, tomorrow. Don't go all at once and practice social distancing. But yes, I mean, Robert Morris Johnson Pit is in SeaTac. Herbert Bayer's Mill Creek earthwork is, it's only like 20 minutes away in Kent. I highly encourage a visit. This photo you're looking at right now was taken by me on Sunday. It's a lovely place to be right now. especially in these days when, you know, Seattle Art Museum is unfortunately closed right now, but you still can see artwork safely with works like these. So I would start there. There's also some around city where when, you know, things lift, you'll be able to see them a little bit more. Mary Miss has an installation on UW's Medical Center campus. And yeah, you can find more online, but I would start with these two.
Great. Let's see. Why were these projects never realized?
Another good question. They were never really intended to be realized. The part 2 of the symposium, or part 2 of the project, was really designed to be a symposium, to gather these ideas together, to have conversation, to have dialogue and debate. And out of those came these projects. Now, I say they were never intended to be realized, but they were assigned actual sites. So I have to imagine in the back of everyone's mind, the possibility existed. And indeed, that one on Lakeside Sand and Gravel Pit, they pursued an environmental review, or an engineering review rather. But the initial project, the initial funds were enough to realize Robert Morris. We all know what budgets will do. So while I think in the back of the mind, the possibility existed, this initially was designed to be more of a thought experiment.
Great. Kind of going back to the earlier question related to sites that people could go and explore. Is there any resource out there that people could get a list of all these great works?
Interesting question. For these works in particular, you can find a lot of really good information about the history of and their current existence on the King County Archives website. If you just Google King County Archives Earthworks, it'll come up. It's a fantastic resource. The city of Kent also on their website has a like bike ride that you can do yourself that links both these two and a couple others in the city of Kent. So I encourage you to check those two resources out as a place to start.
Great. There were a couple of questions that were having to do with how to maintain the art that is created out of the land. And somebody mentioned the site in Kent and that it seems neglected.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, maintenance for the Morris Pit in particular was kind of a question mark since it opened. I mean, I mentioned that it experienced really serious erosion a month later and immediately needed work. It was just graded a little too steeply, and then we had unexpectedly heavy rainfall. So it was immediately rehabilitated, and then the county undertook some pretty major renovations in the 90s to clean it up. I know the city of Kent has also undertaken some large scale cleanups of that park. I will say that these photos were taken Sunday, so I don't know how many employees are out there working on it right now. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt and a grain of kindness. But yeah, I mean, I think with all of these projects, all it takes is time, effort, and public funds to keep them up to date and up to looking their best. But the question of maintenance is actually really interesting one for Earthworks, because for some artists like Robert Smithson, it was not meant to be maintained. Spiral Jetty was designed to raise and lower above and below the surface of the water, depending on the time of year, depending on the amount of rainfall. Kind of in a kind of scary way, it's been viewable for a long time now, for many years, but that was not always the case. So museums, conservators, public agencies that might own these works have to bear in mind artists' intent and wishes, and whether these works should be maintained, and if so, how, and if not, how to let it live its natural life.
Great. A couple of people want to hear what you think about a couple of things. Let's see. Have you visited the Dune Park in Tacoma, built on the Superfund site of the copper smelting plant? And does it fit in?
I haven't, but I'm writing it down. Dune Park in Tacoma.
Yes.
All right. I haven't, and I'm not familiar with it, so I appreciate the hot tip. I will be there this weekend.
Another one, are you familiar with the landform in Luther Burbank Park on Mercer Island? It looks very much like the first site in your presentation, and it attracts many children.
I'm not. I'll visit that one too. This is why these conversations are so great. I benefit too.
Here's one. Could highway design and layout be considered in the realm of earthworks?
Interesting. I mean, again, the Earthworks particularly is really meant to be or conceived as a sculptural intervention. Highway design, I would not fall under that category. But of course, you know, landscape design and landscape history is its own very rich avenue. And I love these questions because it does point to what's so unique about this project is it does exist in that weird gray area of, you know, these are sculptures. These are artists creating sculptures, but it's also a government tool. It's also something designed for rehabilitation, for public access, for communities to use these spaces. So this is what made this project so unique and so unprecedented, is that it exists in all of these different worlds. So it's an interesting question. And yeah, I would encourage you to look into some histories of landscaping, because highway design in particular is a whole another ballgame, a very interesting one.
Great. We have time, I think, for a couple more. What do you think are the prospects of these type of reclamation projects now?
Oh, I hope they're high. No, it's a great question. And, you know, like I said, a lot of this work came out of the 60s and 70s environmental movements. I hope that as our current environmental movement gains steam, that public support for these kinds of projects would increase. That said, it takes a special magical mixture of people, time, and place to realize something like this. So I hope that there are opportunities for artists to participate in projects like this in the future. I think they benefit all of us very much.
Great. Let's see. Are any of the proposed locations still available? Could any of these projects be actualized?
Oh, that's a great question. Quite a few of them are not. Like I said, one is the Urban Bay Nature Preserve. I'm not sure about all of them, to be frank. And I tried to, you know, Google stock because we're social distancing and I can't go there myself right now to all of these sites, and couldn't find concrete information about all of that. But I suspect that all of them have been built up by now, and probably the practicality of realizing these is gone.
Great. We still have some more questions coming in, but I know we are running out of time.
Well, thank you all. Those are wonderful questions. Thank you for joining me today. This was really a treat to join you in this virtual Brave New World. We hope you enjoyed tuning in. And if you like this, I hope you'll join us for the next ones. On your slides here, you'll see the dates for our next Conversations with Curators. Coming up in 2 weeks, we have Barbara Brotherton, our Curator of Native American Art, talking about this fabulous new commission by Michael Nicol Yagilanis, which is installed at Seattle Art Museum right now. Some of you may have had a chance to see it before, and if not, you'll have a chance to see it when we reopen. So please join us for that great talk and for the next 2. In the meantime, stay well, stay safe, stay home with Sam, and we look forward to seeing you when we reopen. Thanks, everyone.